Thank you. And I think that's a great way to set up this conversation. I just want to say a few words about Simon and NDN, because NDN really has been my political home since it started 12 years ago now, this summer. And remember running into Simon at the Chicago convention a few lifetimes ago, and him talking about this new organization he was going to start. And it's been my political home not just because it's one of the few places that would take me, but because it really has been the place that most represents the kind of politics that I believe in, and that is the reason that I'm here today, and the reason I think so many of us are here today. That kind of forward-looking, exciting, creative vision of what American politics should be, and what the Democratic Party should be. And I say this literally all the time, whoever I'm talking to, that if you really want to know what's going to be going on in American politics in a few years, and what's going to be conventional wisdom a few years after that, look at what NDN is talking about today. Because whether it was the rise of Silicon Valley and its importance, whether it was the rise of Latinos as a voting power, whether it was the rise of the Netroots and all of that represented, whether it was the new progressive infrastructure, I can go down the list. All of the things that everybody talks about today are the things that Simon and NDN were talking about years before anybody else. So I am honored to be here today with him. It goes without saying. I'm wearing two hats. My main hat here is as editor of Democracy, a journal of ideas, which if it were not for the wonderful people at FedEx, we would have a bunch of copies for everybody here today. But if you come back on Monday, we will have copies for everybody. Luckily, though, this is Netroots Nation, so you can go to democracyjournal.org and get everything there, and you won't have to read it in the Dead Tree edition. But that's my first hat. My second hat is as the author of Candy Bombers, the book that Simon mentioned. Thank you, Vanna. But let me kind of weave those two things together, and I'll start out talking about the book. The book really begins, opening pages are really 60 years ago this summer, June 1948, and it takes place on the night that Thomas Dewey is being nominated as the next president of the United States at the Republican Convention in Philadelphia. And Harry Truman is watching the convention on television, first time a convention is broadcast, this new media environment of the time, and this transformational moment. And it's a moment in America when things are really coming at loose ends for this country, and especially in its foreign policy. It's 3 years after the end of World War II, and by every measure, the occupation of Germany is failing. The country is becoming more anti-democratic as each month goes by, becoming more and more pro-Nazi as each month goes by. The security situation, the economic situation is getting worse and worse. And there is a sense that this huge experiment is about to come falling apart. In Berlin, the capital city, 3/4 of the housing is uninhabitable. Packs of wolves are roaming through the streets. People have been living at lower than starvation levels for about 4 years at that point. And just as that occupation is at a low end, so is the American foreign policy of the post-war world at a low end. Again, 3 years after the end of World War II, and America is really back on its heels. All through the previous year before that summer of 1948, the countries of Eastern Europe that were democracies at that point start falling one by one to what seems to be very clearly an advancing Soviet threat. Poland and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, each of them start falling to Soviet power, and those democracies are extinguished. And at that point, everybody knows that the next place the Soviets are going to move is Berlin, this island of democracy, the western part of it, an island of democracy, 2.5 million people in one of the largest cities in the world at that point, living surrounded by Soviets for 90 miles in every direction. America's role in the world is being denigrated. The faith of the world is standing at, America's lost the faith of people around the world. You have the Marshall Plan announced a year earlier, and yet after almost a year, Congress has not taken action on it. It's still sitting in committee. Nobody wants to embrace it. both the right and the left of American politics are strongly opposed to the Marshall Plan. You have America's military basically having been almost completely disbanded after World War II. And there was a sense that not only is the Soviet threat going to be going to Berlin, but really Germany was after that. France and Italy are really seen as on the verge of a communist takeover. And of course, Harry Truman's political standing in that June of 1948 is also at a low point. As I said, Thomas Dewey is being nominated. The Democratic Party is fractured. You have Henry Wallace running as really the representative of the heart and soul of the Democratic Party, the person who had been Franklin Roosevelt's vice president and was seen by most activist Democrats as the person who should have taken Roosevelt's place as the inheritor of the Roosevelt revolution in American politics, was then fired by Truman from Truman's cabinet, sets out in 1947 on this huge campaign around the country, getting hundreds of thousands of people to come see him in these enormous stadium rallies, something we have not seen in American politics any time before that point, and probably something that wasn't equaled until maybe Dean in 2003 or Obama in 2007, and kind of the excitement about a candidate in a pre-presidential election year. And so with these two of Franklin Roosevelt's vice presidents running against one another, the Democratic Party is split in a very fundamental way. And on that night in June of 1948, June 24th, is when the Soviets put a blockade around the western part of Berlin, cutting off all of the food and supplies that those 2.5 million people were relying on a daily basis in order to keep themselves from completely starving. Every piece of food really that people were eating there, every piece of coal that they were using to heat their homes, to power their industries and factories, their workplaces, all of the medicine, clothing, everything really that those 2.5 million people counted on was suddenly cut off from the world. And Truman really had three options at that point. The first is the one that just about every single one of his foreign policy advisors said was really our only option, and that was to abandon West Berlin. George Marshall, George Kennan in the State Department at that time, people like Omar Bradley in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all these people saying that really America had no choice but to leave West Berlin, to turn over those 2.5 million people to the Soviets. We were outnumbered 62-1 militarily in that area. And these are the people who won World War II, who knew something about the calculus of power and military strength, and they said there's simply no way we can risk being completely overrun by a Soviet invasion. We need to pull back to the western part of Germany and turn over Berlin. You had the general on the ground in Germany, the head of American forces in Europe, General Lucius Clay. His solution was to send an armed convoy, break through the blockade, fire our way past the Soviets, which at that point was pretty clearly would have caused World War III. And the last option was basically just to sit back and do nothing, do what Omar Bradley said was stand on quicksand and watch as the people of West Berlin just starve before our eyes and the eyes of the world, and eventually would probably rise up against us and kick us out of there. And in the midst of this, really as an afterthought, was what started the Berlin airlift. It was just a couple of planes, really the only planes we had at our disposal of the kind of bigger planes, C-54s, that were the defining plane of the Berlin airlift. We had two such planes in all of Europe at the time. There was one daily flight going from Germany, Western Germany, to West Berlin. And so in the midst of this, they said, let's try to augment the rations that we do have, the 20 days of stockpiles that are in West Berlin, augment them even by a few hours as we try to mull over this decision and figure out what we can do diplomatically. And so we did that for a day or so, did that for a few more days, brought more planes, and really against the better judgment of all of the wise men, of all of the great thinkers of American foreign policy and military strength, Truman made the decision to put all the resources we had into this aerial lifeline, even though it put America's military strength in grave threat because it could have easily been destroyed by the Soviets in an invasion. That is really kind of the background to this whole story, but where it fits into what we're talking about today most clearly is in a number of ways. And the first and foremost is that that moment was really a moment of enormous improvisation, one where we were living in a completely different moment in American history, the first time that we had ever been at the summit of world power, not just in a time of war, but in a time of the threat of war, when we looked around and there were no other great competing powers in the free world. Britain and France and all these other powers had been decimated by the war, and we were standing alone. And so at that summit, we had to, as a country, figure out how we were going to act. What is America's way of acting in the world? What is our special way of acting in the world as a country that is different, perhaps, than the kind of traditional power and traditional way of thinking about things that we saw from the past great powers in the world? And we had this improvisation in the Berlin airlift, but we had it in a whole host of other areas as well. And this was the same period where you had the creation, really because of the Berlin crisis, of NATO. Because of the Berlin crisis, the Marshall Plan came into effect not as just an idea, but as something that was real. You had United Nations a couple of years before that. You had the IMF and World Bank and GATT and all of these kind of great organizations that defined the post-war world coming into being at this point when America was really, in many ways, leading the world in figuring out what is the architecture of the world going to look like. And this is where it comes into play with democracy and what we do at that journal, which is we try to take a step back in terms of thinking about what the world should look like and what progressives should be doing, not in the short term, but in the long term. What kind of thinking should we be putting forward that is not just grounded in our politics, but grounded in our beliefs, grounded in actually tackling some of the big challenges we face today. And that's why I think what Simon said in introducing this conversation is so important, because we really are at a moment that is crying out for some real fundamental rethinking of our foreign policy. Yes, we need to figure things out in Iraq and deal with that tragedy for America and what it's all meant. Yes, we need to clean up the mess of the Bush administration. But if we do all that and do all that successfully, we will have failed, because we really are in a much bigger moment right now than all of those kinds of challenges. It is not just about cleaning up the mess of the past few years. It is really about thinking in an original way about the kind of world we want to be building right now. Because we are dealing with a set of threats that are not just the next generation of the kinds of threats we faced before, whether it was communism or fascism, but some very different kinds of threats. We are dealing with a set of threats that, as many people have talked about, know no boundaries, whether it is global terrorism or global warming or global poverty or global disease. These are kinds of threats that aren't really going to be associated with a nation state. And our thinking of foreign policy throughout American history, and really, since 1688, when you had the Treaty of Westphalia, has been really the idea that the great challenges of the world are coming from other nation states. And that's no longer true at this moment. We are in a moment where it's not going to be, at least for the foreseeable future, some other great nation state that's going to be confronting us. It's going to be these kinds of threats that all nation states and all countries around the world are going to be facing. And at the same time we're dealing with that, we're also dealing with a world where, for the first time, you have most people in the world living in democracies. And so you have to speak not just to a king or a dictator or somebody else, but you actually have to, on a regular basis, be able to speak directly to people around the world, because they are the ones who are pulling the strings of those countries, and you have to be able to convince them, and not just function at the level of ambassadors talking to one another at embassies, but speak directly to people. And you have to do that not just for the reason of the fact that most people are living in democracies right now, but the fact that the solutions to the kinds of challenges we face are going to be ones where governments are going to play an enormous role, but they're not going to play the only role, and that a lot of it's going to be solved from a bottom-up level. If we're going to really tackle climate change, yes, we are going to have the kinds of things that Al Gore was talking about this morning happen at the level of governments. We are going to have the successor to Kyoto that's going to come along and really have countries deal with their economy in a very different way, but we're also going to have to be able to convince people to act in different ways in other countries, just as we're trying to convince people to conserve and recycle and do all these things in our own countries. The solution to climate change is going to happen in these big international conferences, but it's also going to happen when you convince a factory owner in China to change his light bulbs. The solution to the kind of great pandemic diseases that are threatening so much of the world is going to be when you convince people in the world to practice better hygiene or to practice safe sex. And that's not going to be something that happens from the governmental level. And the last thing is what Simon said as well, which is that we are dealing not just with a set of threats, but really a set of opportunities. That this moment of globalization, broadly spoken, not just in terms of the economy, but everything else, is one that we can really use as a way to tackle and to be able to have an opportunity to reshape the world in a much more progressive way, to be able to reach into the lives of people in countries who, when all this was happening in 1948, were ignored. People in the dark places of the world, Africa and Asia and all these places that were so long ignored. We have the power now, as America leading a free world and leading a set of people around the world and leading forces of democracy and freedom, to be able to have an impact on the lives of people that will not only be able to change their lives for the better, but also inspire them to believe in the values that we believe in as America, and inspire them to believe in America as a force for good. And I think I'll just leave on that note because, out of the Berlin airlift in that moment, we were able to create a world where we did not go into World War III, a world where you did not have the Soviets being able to occupy all of Europe and Asia as looked very possible in these months, but you're also able to turn around the people of Germany who went from hating America to loving America, and you're able to inspire people around the world. The biggest protest in solidarity with America after 9/11 was in Berlin. And there's a reason that Barack Obama is speaking in Berlin on Thursday, where he is going to, I think there's a good chance he'll talk a lot about this 60th anniversary of the Berlin airlift and what it meant. And there's a reason for that, because even in Berlin today, 60 years later, after generations have passed, they look at America in ways that are very different from any place else in the world. I'm going a little long. I'll just leave with one story, which is about 2 months ago, there was something that happened in Berlin for the first time in its history. And that was a citizen referendum was put on the ballot. They had the power to do so, kind of like we have initiatives here, but it had never been done before, that you had people in Berlin gathering signatures to put a question on the ballot, and the question was about opposing the decision of the government of the city of Berlin to shut down Tempelhof Air Base, which was the American air base during the Berlin airlift. And 200,000 Berliners signed a petition to put that on the ballot to stop the city government from doing so. And it was only an advisory referendum, so there was rather low turnout, but of the people who showed up, 60% of Berliners voted to keep the airport open. Now think to yourself, any place else in the world that you would have a noisy, polluting, private jet airport located smack in the middle of the city. Imagine an airport basically right here on Congress Street in Austin or in your home city that loses $15 million a year, and have the people in that surrounding area voted to keep it open rather than close it down. And the sole reason they did was because of the people of Berlin's memories, people who are alive then, people who weren't alive then, about America and what it represented to them. And think to yourself, are we doing the things in the world today, defensively, proactively, in terms of seizing opportunities in places like Baghdad and Kabul and everywhere else in the world that are going to engender that same kind of faith in America and what it represents 60 years from now?
Very good.